more people would join. Welcome to Women in Econ and Policy's first inaugural session. We are really thrilled that this is happening, and we're so thrilled that all of you have joined us for this session today. So Women in Econ and Policy was set up to create an inclusive space for women who are interested in economics, policy, and development to grow together and, more importantly, learn from each other and have a space where they can talk about their interests and their experiences, and a space that has no judgment and encourages you to grow. And for that reason, we're really excited that Ruth signed up to be a member and also agreed to do our very first session, and an interactive session where we talk about our personal experiences, how difficult it is to be a woman in this field, and advice that she would have for young professionals like so many of us are. I'm going to do a quick introduction. Before that, some housekeeping announcements. This session is mostly based on questions that we received before the session, before we start today. So the questions will be based around those. We would like to have some time at the end to take questions live. So if you have questions, please put them up on chat. We will be compiling those. And then if we get some time left, we will be taking those at the end. So I'm going to jump into an introduction for Dr. Ruth Levine, and then Prathama will be introducing our moderator, Shivani. So Dr. Levine is a development economist with 3 decades of experience across a spectrum of domains like global health, poverty, development, among others. She's currently the CEO and partner at IDinsight. Her extensive background includes positions as the program director at the Hewlett Foundation, the vice president, and a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, as well as assuming the role of the deputy assistant administrator in the Bureau of Policy, Planning, and Learning at the US Agency for International Development. I think my personal thing from your experience is just your role in setting up 3IE. And I think it's so exciting that you have a PhD, but also have experience working in this space with policymakers and corporates. And it's really exciting to have you on board. And we're really excited to see how this session goes. I'm going to hand over to Prathama to introduce Shivani, and then it's over to the two of you.
It's a pleasure having you, Dr. Ruth. And we also have with us Ms. Shivani, who has a lot of experience in the development sector. She's been actively engaged for the last 7 years across the sectors of education as well as livelihood. And in her recent engagement with Medha, she was leading a team of program design as well as evaluation. And she played a key role in the transition of the organization to large-scale processes in place, with a team in place, having and handling third-party evaluation processes for that. She's also now working on a remote mentoring program for young women specifically who are entering the labor force and are keen to become young professionals and move on in their career. So it's a pleasure having you, Shivani, and over to you both. Looking forward to the session.
Hi, Dr. Ruth. This is a brilliant pleasure being able to interact with you like this. So to sort of like straight off deep dive into the deep end, when we collected these questions before the sessions, a lot of the participants were very keen to understand your own career journey in the world of policy. So right from what prompted you as a young student to explore economics, and from there, how did your journey shape up as a professional, to being someone who has been steadily in the position of leadership in setting up policy think tanks and facilitating evidence-based policy design and research. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah, sure. I'm so delighted to be here and to see everybody who is giving up, I think in most cases, your Saturday evenings for this. Maybe I have the pandemic to thank for not having a lot of competition for what you can do on a Saturday evening, but I really appreciate it. let me just say a couple of words about why I'm so excited to be here and so pleased that this group has been started. And then I'm very happy to answer your question. That's always fun to talk about oneself. I did some work over the past year on women in leadership, and particularly women in leadership in economics and several other fields. And it was kind of a private project, and I had not worked on that, in any scholarly way before. And so I was reading the literature, and it became so clear, both from qualitative work and then from some survey work, how important it is for people who are thinking about entering or thinking about their life choices, to see a whole range of options open to them, and how influential it can be for people to see that a particular path is open to people like them in some way. Each person is unique, but you're kind of looking for, oh, a woman can do that, or a Black person can do that, or somebody can do that in their country or in another country. So I am really much more committed even than I have been in the past to participating in efforts like this that just help people see what the range of options are. And I think particularly in the field of economics, the graduate school experience is very much oriented toward people who wish to pursue academic paths. And of course, those are your immediate role models, right? By definition, the academics. And so seeing how many other options are open to people who have training in economics, I think is really valuable. Okay, so thank you guys for setting up not just this session, but the whole experience of kind of a place for solidarity and mentoring and support to one another. Okay, so then answering your question, I'll be brief. You know, I'm 60 years old, so I could talk for a long time about each and every moment in the kind of journey so far. But maybe I'll highlight a few that might be helpful to frame things up. So when I left well, maybe I'll go back a little bit further. So part of my childhood was spent in the Philippines because my father, who was is now very much a thriving senior, but spent his career on the faculty at Cornell University. He was working in the Philippines as part of the kind of Green Revolution team, working on improved rice varieties. He was an agricultural engineer. And so I spent part of my childhood in the Philippines, which was very helpful, I think, in setting a course for the future. So it's interesting sometimes to think back about your early experiences. So when I left my undergraduate program, also at Cornell University, I really had no clue what I wanted to do, and spent some time just essentially doing odd jobs to pay the rent. And one of those jobs was helping write proposals for funding for a faculty member who was working on an international health program. And so I just got interested in the substance, and she was also very much a feminist, and so this was sort of the early 1980s, and she had a strong kind of gender dimension to the work that she was doing. And I got very interested in the substance, and decided that I was interested in, for graduate work, looking at gender issues, particularly as they related to choices about work. And so I went to Johns Hopkins for graduate school, and really found kind of economic theory and the empirical applications to be really fascinating ways to structure problems, to think about problems, very coherent kind of theoretical frameworks. And at the same time, I found it frustrating because it was very hard to pursue this set of questions about gender and employment, gender, labor, and labor market outcomes in a field that, particularly at that time, really rejected the idea that there was any imperfections in the labor market, any structural bias. And so early on, I remember very distinctly sitting in an early graduate econ course and asking a question about imperfections in the labor market. And the professor turned to me and said, "I think you belong in the sociology department." So that was the last time I think I opened my mouth in class for fear of being shunted off to some other place. I really wanted to stay in economics. So when I was also kind of headed for an academic future, and when I defended my dissertation, one of the questions, the only question I actually couldn't answer, was, what are the policy implications of your research? I had done a study on the relationship between childbearing and work in urban Mexico, and knew a lot about that topic and really had no idea what the policy implications were. So as you can tell, I really was headed for an academic career. But at that time, I was also getting together with my then boyfriend, now husband. And for a range of reasons, he was not able to leave Baltimore, and I didn't want a long distance relationship. And so I looked for academic jobs in the 50-mile radius around Baltimore. And as you probably know, if you're a junior, a young person on the job market for an academic position, you can't be too fussy about geography. And that was true in 1990, and it is probably truer today. And I was fussy about geography. So I did not find any. I applied for one, didn't get it. I did not get an academic position, but the rent still did need to be paid. And so I got a job at the Urban Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. And so that was the first time. And they hired me because they thought I'd taken enough economics courses so that I could work on a health financing project. And I rapidly learned that health economics is actually like a whole separate field that I had to teach myself a bit. But what happened at the Urban Institute was that I, first of all, got the thrill of actually getting a paycheck, which was really wonderful. And I saw that the kind of both the theoretical and the empirical, background knowledge that I'd acquired in graduate school connected to real live policy questions that I could imagine would affect real live human beings. And so this question of what are the policy implications in some abstract way became very, very real in the context of the work that the Urban Institute was doing. And that just flipped a switch for me. And I never looked back at academia. I have since then pursued finding wherever possible that connection between serious analytic work and consequential policies. And in the more recent parts of my career, it's been less me actually doing the research and more finding ways through funding organizations or in other ways to support that work. So I've probably gone on longer than you'd hoped, but hopefully it was a useful start. When you look back at a career, you see the picture in sort of the way, a dot-to-dot puzzle or works, where you go from one to the next, and you only kind of at the end see what the picture is.
Yeah, and also the wonderful part is that I feel this journey, while you shared, it started very long time ago, it's still very representative of what a lot of our journeys also are. A lot of us are also accidental economists. We ended up studying economics maybe because we were good at the subject, And then we understood this whole range of implications that it has in real life, and we were all taken aback by that. And a lot of our job choices are also, they continue to be informed by just logistical and challenges of family responsibilities or personal priorities. And it's not always about like kind of finding the perfect opportunity, but making the opportunity that you have at hand work for you, and then go from there. And so just in this regard, if you had any advice, like now looking back at these years, if you had any career advice for yourself when you were sort of starting out back in the 20s, and you shared a few things, like you, even as a student, you learned to be quiet for the fear of being shunted off. And then you shared that eventually you kind of like evolved to be a professional who was looking more to connect analytics with real policy implications, and kind of like, you know, moving away from the academic course. So is there any specific career advice, or in general like life advice or navigating life in career advice that you would give to yourself as a, like in your 20s or in your 30s when you were sort of like just getting career?
Yeah, sure. It's always, you know, presumptuous to give people advice. I think they, you know, maybe the most important is to, you know, that old expression, to thine own self be true, really, to know yourself, and then sort of hold that as your North Star when you're making decisions about how to navigate choices. So, you know, my advice is based on sort of what my values have been. I guess, yeah, maybe there's some generic, you know, good advice. So one is, you know, I think really pay attention to the qualities of your supervisor, the person who most influences your work experience or your academic experience. If they're a jerk, really try to get away from them. It's very traumatizing, I think, to spend a long time working for or with somebody who is, you know, maybe not you know, intentionally cruel, although that is the word that comes to mind, but somebody who really treats you badly and with disrespect. And I think, you know, we'd like to think that that happens rarely. I actually think it happens quite frequently. And that, you know, there are reasons for that. That behavior is not sufficiently kind of censured. And so, you know, there are systemic reasons why you're going to encounter that. But I would say, like, really make a huge effort to get away from that as soon as possible, even if it means moving to a less prestigious environment. You don't want to be, I think, in sort of caught in a game of just taking a role or being in a position because it looks good on your resume, even if the actual experience day to day is really terrible. So that was all framed in the negative. I guess maybe a more positive version is gravitate as quickly as possible to work with people who want to foster your, you know, help you realize your potential, will give you a lot of space and affirmation. Really try to find those people. And I have been fortunate in my life to have been able to find those people, and then I stick to them like glue. So I have followed people, you know, I've for example, Nancy Birdsall, I had the really remarkable opportunity to work with Nancy Birdsall when I was at the Inter-American Development Bank. And just a short story about that, if I might. So I was working at the Inter-American Development Bank as a kind of, you know, in sort of an operations role, helping to develop loans in health and education, kind of a medium level role, I would say. And I had maybe about 7 years of experience post graduate school by then, something like that, and maybe a little bit less. And it was a time when my husband and I were starting our family. And I had my daughter, who is now at 23, and I realized that I did not, the job I had required a lot of travel. And I realized after having my daughter that at least for a time it would be, it just make me really unhappy to have a lot of travel and be away from her and my husband for long periods of time. And there were very few non-traveling jobs at the Inter-American Development Bank at that time. I think that's probably still true. And so I thought, wow, you know, I'm going to have to find a different place to work. And it happened at that time that a position became open in the office, that in the executive vice president's office, and Nancy Birdsall was the executive vice president. And I don't exactly know whether she just sort of took pity on me or she actually wanted me to work in her office. But in any case, she gave me that opportunity. And Nancy is just a remarkable, remarkable mentor and role model for both men and women. Really tremendous in every way. So I had a great experience working with her while she was there, and then she left. This is the end of my part about like sticking to people who are good for you. And then I found a way to work with her again when she started the Center for Global Development. And so if you find somebody who you find yourself thriving when you are working with them, follow them. Do everything you possibly can to stick with them or somebody like them. That's a long-winded bit of advice. The other may be a little bit embedded in what I was saying, and my own story is that, you know, when people are always making decisions based on a variety of things. It's not just, you know, what is my career trajectory? And I think, you know, clearly for women, family considerations are a major factor. And I have found that when I have, when I've sort of made decisions that I knew were best for my relationship with my family, so it wasn't so much for them, it was for me and my family life. It has turned out to be extraordinarily positive in my own career. So the kind of construct of it's a zero-sum game, you choose your family or you choose a good career path. For me, I have found that they have been very much reinforcing, not intention. And I am not alone. I think if you talk with a lot of women who have had kind of, I think, you know, obviously there are sometimes trade-offs and tensions, but I think you can find a lot of examples where overall in your life, you find the greatest happiness and rewards if by maybe not seeing it as a zero-sum game. So those are my two kind of long-winded bits of advice.
Truly, and also like I think it's also like you said, it's difficult I also feel that it's sometimes difficult, especially for women in a workplace, to identify unjust criticism or unjust essentially basically someone being a jerk, because we keep trying to make excuses for them and we also question ourselves more. But perhaps I think like what's very useful and what's a very good takeaway from this advice is that it's always easy to find inspiration though. So when you do find someone who inspires you and believes in you, then you follow them. You definitely like seek inspiration though. If there is a lack of inspiration in your manager, if they are not kind of like pushing you to perform to your potential, or like they're hindering it in some way, then it's probably not the best setup to be in. And also the bit about like making decisions that are for yourself. So like essentially you're defining your own success benchmarks, and not because either of those, like one of family bliss or the one of like extreme professional excellence, they are again like unfair and imposed benchmarks, and you should basically define your own and be and embrace that. It's not a zero-sum game. So
Yeah.
yeah, extreme.
I would say
Yeah.
one other thing,
Like,
which is hard advice
yes.
to sometimes pursue, because so much depends on luck and other factors. But I think a kind of consistent pattern across many women of at least of my generation who have had good balance between family and work life is a supportive partner, and one who also has a broad view of what success benchmarks are. I just heard a podcast about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Supreme Court justice, and the podcast interviewed the 8, I guess, other women who were in her starting Harvard Law class in 1959. And so, women who had had a similar, kind of set of constrained, honestly, opportunities. I mean, the difficulties for women of that era in a non-traditional profession are really, really profound. And basically the bottom line of all these interviews, it's a great, it's in Slate, so it's online if you're interested. But what I took away from it is that what made Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life much different and much more, kind of successful and prominent and maybe rewarding than many of her peers was that her husband was incredibly supportive and would, cook and change diapers and make his own career sacrifices so that she could pursue opportunities. And, it is certainly true for me that my husband is extremely, extremely supportive. And so I think, choose your boss well and choose your partner well.
Before moving on to other questions, a quick reminder to other participants, please feel free to keep posting your queries in the chat. We'll be taking them up towards the end, and if there are any which can be good follow-up queries to existing discussion, then we'll also take it up like in between. So please feel free to keep posting those. The other query that we had with regards to your career journey was when you found yourself transitioning to leadership roles and eventually, like Prerna shared, setting up of 3IE. So how did you, your major takeaways from your experience of like taking on leadership? How did you, what do you think were the things that helped you flourish as a leader? What were your most important lessons there? And what were the things that you felt were, most worked when you wanted to bring together a diverse cohort to kind of work together and get things done? So how? Yes. So basically, this is the question that about leadership takeaways.
Yeah, great. Gosh, these are such good questions. I think over time, and for me, I think it happened maybe around age 40 or so, but should have happened earlier. I sort of figured out what my real core strengths are as a person, probably, but certainly as a professional and a leader, and really leaned into and made the most of those and stopped worrying about all the things I'm not particularly good at, and just so I'll try to be a little more specific. But I think what I'll describe is what works for me and maybe somebody with a personality type like mine, and the bigger message is you'll have different strengths, and really just lean into those and make the most of those in any setting. And so just so what I figured out, again a little bit late, was that I'm essentially a relatively introverted person, and so I had always sort of thought, well, many leaders, many people who are visible in positions of leadership are actually extroverted people. And they're quite, they speak very freely, and they're charismatic, and they bring a huge amount of energy to, public events and so forth. And so I always thought, like, oh, I need to somehow be that. And honestly, that's just exhausting, and I'm not good at it. And so instead of sort of thinking, well, that forecloses a role that is a leadership role, I figured out, well, there are some aspects of being more introverted, more sort of taking not quite the back seat, but like listening before speaking, thinking before speaking, that there's aspects of that can be very, very, really contribute a huge amount. And it maybe contribute as much, or sometimes in many cases, perhaps more than sort of taking, very sort of being very, very proactive and sort of putting yourself forward. So when I was at the Center for Global Development, we developed a basically a model of working that was oriented. I don't know if people knew that this was why, but it was basically oriented toward my style. And that is a sort of policy working group arrangement where we convened a group of people who, maybe about 10 or 12 people who had expertise around a particular policy question, to work together in a series of meetings over, maybe a year, 18 months, with a lot of background work being done in between those meetings to arrive then at a consensus report that would lay out a set of recommendations that could be implemented. And it's not the most unique way of working, but it was it did work very well, including for the establishment of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, also for the creation of the first advanced market commitment for a new vaccine, and for a number of different kinds of kind of policy policy initiatives that took an idea and brought it to kind of real world action. And those working groups, in those working groups, I typically would take the role of the chair, but I like to think it was a very inclusive model of chairing, trying to draw out other people's ideas, bring them together. It's not particularly important to me to take credit for things, and so I would happily kind of ghostwrite things, or the important thing was to like get the work done and get the ideas out. So I don't want to like oversell how great how well I did that, but just to illustrate that was a way of getting work done in the world that had a lot of has had a lot of impact, that drew on my core strengths and didn't make me do things that were that I wouldn't do well because they weren't in my kind of sweet spot. So the big message is figure out what you're sort of, what you would, just the way you show up in the world, and lean into it. And some of you will be way out there in front and leading with lots of energy and your own ideas and vision, and others will be a little bit more like me and being in not only a facilitating role, but being in a role of kind of bringing things together, synthesizing them. And if there's somebody who wants to kind of be the spokesperson and is better at that, then that's what they should do.
Yes, true. Then it also reminds me of the 6 hats, like how we all have different communication styles and different ways of thinking, and then yes, eventually different ways of leading as well. Some of us lead from the front, some of us like to, some of us are very good at building networks and bonds, and then that kind of lends us to manage brilliant diverse teams. Have you ever had to face any challenges in this journey, which you feel that you wouldn't have had to face? Like, so apart from the ones that you've already shared, which were the ones that you faced as a younger professional, but in your journey as a leader or as a person who had to kind of, communicate with large groups, have you ever had to face any challenges which you feel you wouldn't have to face if you were a man? Like any challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't, I would say none really come to mind. Yeah, I think the challenges that I'd frame are that my leadership style, as I've just talked about, is not, doesn't kind of, it's not the stereotypical leadership style. And so to some extent that maps onto gender roles. It's a little hard to, separate, because many of the leaders that we see in the world at, in corporate settings or, in large funding agencies in government are male. And so it's a little hard to tell, like, separate out like leadership style from gender. But I do think that there have been a few times when I've been, well, maybe what I bring to a project or an organization has not been fully recognized because it doesn't read like, super powerful, out in front, visionary leadership. And that has been a bit of a source of frustration because, so for example, there are jobs I haven't gotten because people said, well, you're a good number 2. So I am a good number 2, but I'm also a good number 1. But it takes a little bit of imagination to have a view of what a number 1 can be. Yeah, so I would say that has been a bit of a source of frustration, especially since not infrequently you see people who have more traditional leadership styles actually failing pretty spectacularly because they're not good listeners, because they, plunge ahead with their own ideas even when they would be well advised to bring others with them in a more inclusive way. So yeah, so I guess I'd attribute it more to that than strictly to gender issues. But I certainly have seen others. I'm not discounting that is a big consideration. I certainly have seen other women who have been, I think, more affected by gender bias in an explicit way.
Which basically like brings us to our next section, and I see that we've also stuck a chord here with the audience. We've had like a series of questions on chat around like essentially like what it means to be a woman in the field of economics and policy, which is also what our next section is all about. So something that's coming across in the chat and something that we also felt like from our pre-survey of the session, that there's a perception that women do not find easy representation on advisory councils or positions of influence in the policy or like positions of leadership, while they're maybe very well represented otherwise in the academia or like in the student body. But eventually, like when they have to move up the career ladder, that representation seems to dwindle, which is again perhaps not a unique phenomenon in the sector of economics and policy. That's perhaps the case in most sectors, but also here. So is this true? And if it is, then what do you think are some of the common causes that hold women back from progressing up the career ladder? And probably like one more follow-up question to this would be, what do we as professionals and as a community, what can we do to help ourselves and also each other to kind of like, change this state of affairs?
Yeah, wow. I would love to have a, real conversation about this. Well, as I said, I mentioned that I did some work over the past year on women in leadership and looking at exactly this question of why is there more or less a leaky pipeline? And, economics is a fascinating example of a very hostile field for women and any other group that experiences discrimination in the world. And it's so interesting. You probably know that over, this may not be true in India, but in general, the field of economics has fewer women proportionately in the graduate level now than it did 20 years ago. So that's in contrast, for example, to the law, where there are, in many countries, it's almost 50-50 in terms of graduating law students. In the judiciary, there are, 40% of the judges are women. Again, India is a bit of an exception here, and I know many of you are in India. But so economics are something like actively hostile to women in economics. That said, there is also, a kind of, as I said, leaky pipeline, as you were saying, as women progress either in academia or in policy positions or in other research institutions. So why is that? So now I'm drawing more on research than my own experience. And this won't come as any shock to you. Certainly there's tensions between sort of family responsibilities and professional demands. And there are many institutions where the professional demands are frankly unreasonable in terms of the amount of time that you're supposed to, that you're expected to spend, the amount of, the degree of responsiveness, being on call constantly. It's just incompatible with life and with family life. So that's one. Another, and this pervades really all fields, is a significant amount of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And this is not something that I've experienced in my own life, but it is just really astounding when you read. I have been astounded, I have to say, reading about the prevalence of really extreme versions of sexual harassment and sexual exploitation. So, this may not come as a surprise to many of you, but the extent to which sexual favors are demanded of young women professionals by more senior men is really very, now increasingly documented, and really, I think, deeply affects women's career paths in very detrimental ways. And there may be internal motivation for continuing to put themselves in environments where they are among the only women. It can be a very vulnerable place to be, particularly when the organizations in which you work are not enforcing protections against sexual harassment. So that is certainly a pretty profound sort of cause of this leaky pipeline. And then the last thing I'll say is that as you get further and further up the in an organizational hierarchy or in your career, the kind of clubbiness and the extent to which networks are the driver of what your opportunities are really increases vastly. So, when you're entering at a junior position, there's often, lots and lots of applicants, and they have some kind of competitive process and maybe take a test. And oddly, it's not fully a meritocracy, but it is more meritocratic. The higher you get, it's so much more about who you know, whether you look like them, whether they see a younger version of themselves in you, whether they think hiring you will be risky in some way or not. All of those kind of discretionary factors, fit, cultural fit, the room for not just implicit, but genuinely explicit bias is huge. And so I think that that is also a real factor, which means getting to I think the latter part of your question is sort of what can we do? I think there's people, and I do think things have been getting really significantly better generation to generation. And that in general, although not all the time, women who are more senior are interested in making more space for younger women to thrive. That is not always the case. You can't actually count on that, but it's possible. And so I think that I'm really very optimistic that the number of senior women in kind of policy spaces with economic backgrounds who are making noise about the need to diversify the field, I think it's really very, very positive. Anyway, I'm not quite being fully responsive to your question, but those are a few insights.
There's also this thing which has come up in the chats as well, and this is something that we also experience in general, like in our career. And you had addressed this to a certain extent earlier when you said that when you're working with a manager who is in some way oppressing you, essentially, like get away from that place, because that will hinder your personal growth and professional growth in a lot of ways. But as you move up in the leadership ladder, those opportunities are fewer to kind of move away from those places. And also, someone in the chat just mentioned, and I think it's a common experience, that the aggression that you face from your peers, like especially your competitors for the similar position, kind of keeps getting more like more and more abrasive. And similarly, like on the same way, there has also been a query that when you feel that if you are taking initiative or you're volunteering for a new project, you're basically seen as too eager or too smart, and then you're tending to rub people who are eventually responsible for your promotion the wrong way, and usually men. So how do you, and again, I guess there isn't an easy answer to this, otherwise most of us would be doing it, like that's there. But in your experience, what have the few things that you see have worked for women that you have worked with or that you have seen succeed? Like just in general, like what are the few things that you've seen work for women leaders in economics?
Yeah, what a good and challenging question. I'm particularly struck by the point about when you maybe volunteer for a stretch assignment that can kind of have unintended negative consequences for you, because it's also clear from some of the business literature that that is actually what you should be doing, is to put yourself forward and make yourself available for stretch assignments to demonstrate your increased capacity. So I wouldn't say don't do that. I would say do that. So then I guess the question is, how do you protect yourself against recriminations and so forth? Gosh, do I have any wisdom on this one at all? guess the only thing I'd say is, I don't think that was going to sound right, but I think that you want to do your work in ways that help the people above you, assuming they're not complete jerks. As I'm saying, so I say, I know it's difficult, but you really, really do have to try to get away from being surrounded by jerks. That will have like even a year or two of being in a position where you are systematically disrespected and where you have a stomach ache every time you go to work. That has very long-term effects. So, you should think about it as like needing to move away from something toxic. So anyway, that's back to my original advice, like get away from people, which of course is easier said than done. But if you decrease the priority that you put on being in a prestigious environment, and you increase the priority you put on being in a healthy environment, that is going to serve you much, much better over, like, immediately and over the long term. Because it is often in those prestigious environments that people are allowed to get away with really bad behavior. Okay, so that was what I said at the beginning. So I guess the only thing that occurs to me in response to your question is that assuming you're not working for a complete jerk, you should see part of your success as making the person you're working for look good. And if you do, and I don't mean in a kind of like sycophantic way, but like really doing a top-notch job so that that person can be proud of the work that I'm assuming it's a he, his team is doing. And if you frame, I have certainly often done this, is kind of frame how I do my work and what I work on in ways to say, well, what's going to not so much make me look more impressive, but make the person I'm working for look more impressive. And it's a subtle difference in mindset, and it seems a little bit subservient and wrong when I say it, but actually it's very, very helpful and can create a real bond between you and the person you're working with. They can come to understand how much they depend on you doing a great job. And that's actually a really good environment for mentorship and for them to, they will get the next job and then they will pull you with them. And again, if they're a good person to work for, that's a fantastic kind of arrangement.
Absolutely. And there is, we're kind of like close to our end of time here, but there's one more pressing query which has been coming up in the chat, which is around PhD.
Whoops. Can you repeat?
Okay. So, yes. Yes. Am I more audible now? Am I audible now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So I was saying, like, we're drawing towards the close of our time, but there's like one more pressing query which has been coming up in the chat, which is around advice for women who want to pursue career in academia. Especially, there are a lot of participants who want to pursue PhDs, and they have, the query states that they have come across many unsolicited advice or tweets on quote unquote right age for women to do a PhD. So how should people tackle this ageist bias from the margins? And I guess also in addition to this, generally advice on, because there is extreme hostility sometimes. You mentioned something about like increased demand for sexual favors and like being able to speak up against that kind of harassment as well. So in general, advice for women who want to pursue a career in academia, specific PhDs, how to tackle just bias and also how to address sexual harassment, again, not just for themselves, but also like how to support their fellow students in kind of tackling this.
Yeah, wow. Well, this is not an area I have a lot of either personal experience in or expertise, and there are people who do, and I maybe after this chat I'll send around some information because increasingly I think there are, particularly in the legal field, because they're lawyers, there's some significant amount of work being done to really, understand the prevalence and address the problem of sexual exploitation of, again, young women, with basically grades or degrees withheld in exchange, or only provided in exchange for sexual favors. And it's really terrible, as you know, or as you know, as obvious. But so in terms of like age, and I guess I don't have any particular wisdom on this. I do think that having some work experience between undergraduate and graduate school is extremely helpful in permitting you to see your graduate work through the lens of how it will be useful for policy or for the kind of specific field in which you want to work, the sector in which you want to work. I think often people who are fresh out of undergraduate, at least this is true in the United States, people who went directly from secondary school to a 4-year college experience and then to graduate school, they're sort of professional students. And they're very, very good at studying, but don't necessarily have a perspective of why they are studying, except for perhaps grades and degrees. And that's not the most robust reasons or motivations. So anyway, I think having some even modest work experience, a year or two, first just you're a little more mature. You see maybe in a more focused way, you get more real deep motivation for doing the work. It's much, much easier to come up with a dissertation topic. You're not kind of sitting around going like, oh, where can I get data? Oh, how can I try this new method? I am sorry to say, those are really not the right reasons for choosing a topic. You choose a topic because you are really, really curious about something and you really, really want the answer, and you will find the data and apply the methods that get you that answer. And the way to be excited about a question is to actually have experience in the real world. So, so all of that adds up to at least a year or two out in the real world. And the other reason is that you will acquire and have the chance to practice good project management skills, which many, many people who do doctoral work do not have. And that's why it takes them 5 years and 6 years to do something that in the outside world would take you a year and a half max. So, the amount of kind of wasted time, sorry to be so aggressive about this, but I mean, I look back at I took 5 years to do my doctoral degree. I easily could have done it in a year. And I mean, that same project, easily max a year and a half in a job context, because of all the inefficiencies of being in a graduate program, and the fact that you're unsupervised, you're wandering in the wilderness, your advisor gives you contradictory advice, if advice at all. So you're just kind of left on your own, and you have to manage yourself in a way that can be very, very difficult. It's much easier if you've had experience out in the world with either somebody helping to manage your time, or you just learned because you've been under time pressure to get a project done. You've learned, oh, I actually have to buckle down and do this, and I can't I can't do 79 analyses. I have to do 4 analyses. So anyway, also the last reason to also have some experience in the real world is that you get the thrill of getting a paycheck, and you realize, wow, somebody will pay me for my time. And then you go to graduate school, and except for being a TA and maybe, you know, some microscopic stipend, you're not being paid for your time. In fact, you are paying somebody else, some, you know, elite academic institution. And you really want to be able to internalize the opportunity cost of your time, so that, you know, if I spend 4 years doing my dissertation, great, then I can get out in the real world and start earning money and moving along in my career. And you have just much more of a sense of that if you've had a little early experience. So that is my sermon on get out of school for a little while if you can. And if you haven't done that, if you are currently in a graduate program and you're thinking, ooh, I didn't do that, you know, you can learn from others' experience and just really like set yourself a budget for your project and include the cost of your time, the kind of imputed value of your time. And you will quickly see that you need to organize your life so that you get out of graduate school as soon as possible, because it is very, very costly to dilly-dally in graduate school. So there you go.
There have been some queries around COVID. There have been some queries around impact evaluation and policy, which we will not have the time to take today. But I think that just goes on to demonstrate what a curious and what a very active group Prerna, Pratima, and all of the others have managed to put together here. And I think it also gives us a lot of food for thought for the subsequent sessions that you'll be putting together for this group. So that'd be brilliant. Anything else, like as your closing remarks, anything else, Ruth, that you'd like to share with us at the end of this session to conclude?
I would just say, first of all, again, as I said at the top, I'm just so delighted with the initiative that you guys have taken to put this together, and you must feel from the response that there is a real hunger and you're serving a need. You know, we are all part of a large network and can provide solidarity to each other. And I am sure that there are many women of my cohort and others that would be delighted to meet with you, offer their own experiences, and serve virtually in this world as, you know, with support and ideas and encouragement. So I'm happy to follow up with the organizers to suggest other people you might invite, and hearing a range of perspectives is really valuable. So thank you so much. I feel very honored to have been invited to do this.
That was such a great note, Dr. Ruth. I mean, it's been like a pleasure, and you know, most often, like personally, what we notice, people like higher up in their careers and like so well established as you are, but it was refreshing to see the honesty and humility that you brought about, and I think others would agree, and Prerna would add to that, like your struggles and your decisions were not as crystal clear or like, you know, as demarcated as they usually sound to be. So that was like so refreshing, and also your perspective about how you discovered your own leadership style and how many of us struggle to like fit into roles rather than like find what like works for us. I think that was brilliant to like hearing that from you, and like reassuring in many ways.
Great. Well, good luck. You guys are so fantastic, and I'll look forward to continued engagement, and you know, enjoy life and find the right partner.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you, Shivani, for taking our time, and thank you to everyone. I think Pratima has already summarized how amazing and helpful the session has been, and thank you, Shivani, for really condensing all of the questions that we had and guiding the conversation so well. And thank you to everyone who joined I mean, we hopefully have a lot more exciting things coming up. And Ruth, we're looking forward to talking to you about future sessions that we can do. And yeah, I guess follow us on Twitter and watch out for our upcoming newsletters.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.